Mr. President, I am so pleased today to join my colleague, the senator from Rhode Island, to discuss one of the most important issues facing future generations and our world. That's climate change, an issue that also affects both of our coastal and low-lying states directly. Many may know Delaware's status as the first state to ratify the Constitution, but few of my colleagues, I think, are aware that Delaware is also our country's lowest-lying state. We have the lowest mean elevation. And this status comes with certain challenges, especially from nearly 400 miles of exposed shoreline. That means no part of our state is more than 30 miles from the coast. So the good news is, no matter where you live in my home state, it takes you less than 30 minutes to get to sun and sand. But the challenge is we are particularly vulnerable to the increasing effects of climate change. In recent years, we've seen how flooding can devastate homes and communities up and down our state. Low-lying neighborhoods that often don't have the resources to cope with steadily increasing flooding, like Southbridge in Wilmington, pictured to my right here, are disproportionately affected. Environmental justice has long been a concern of mine and of Senator Whitehouse's, and we had an opportunity to visit the neighborhood of Southbridge, which every time it rains more than an inch or two is significantly flooded. And with subsidence, the steady sinking of the land, and with sea level rise acting in combination on my home state, we are simply going to see more and more challenges from severe flooding due to sea level rise around the globe and in my home state. It's not just houses and neighborhoods that are threatened by sea level rise, it's also businesses and entire industries. There's a broad range of long-established industries and businesses in my state that are placed in coastal areas because of the history of our settlement and development. Somewhere between 15 and 25% of all the land use for heavy industry in my state will likely be inundated by sea level rise by the end of the century. And that doesn't even include all the other productive land use for agriculture, tourism that contributes jobs and revenue to my home state. But despite our small size and our significant exposure, we also punch above our weight when it comes to tackling the challenges of climate change. In places like Southbridge, our communities have come together at the state and local level to find creative solutions to cope with the flooding that is increasingly caused by climate change. This image here demonstrates a plan that's been developed for the South Wilmington Wetlands Project. Senator Whitehouse may describe in more detail his visit to the state of Delaware, but I wanted to open simply by describing this community response to the flooding that you saw in the previous slide. We've come together as a community to plan a cleanup of a brownfield area to create a safe and attractive park for the neighborhood and to improve water quality and drainage in a way that also creates new ecosystems, new opportunities for recreation, and a new future for a community long blighted and often underwater. And that's not the only example of many of actions that have been taken by my home state of Delaware. Delaware also participates in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a collection of 9 mid-Atlantic and northeastern states, including Rhode Island, that have joined together to implement market-based policies to reduce emissions. Since 2009, the participating states have reduced our carbon emissions by 20%, while also experiencing stronger economic growth than the rest of the country, which I view as proof that fighting climate change and strengthening our economy are not mutually exclusive goals. In fact, over the past 6 years, Delaware has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions more than any state in the entire United States. And we've done that by growing our solar capacity 6,000% through multiple utility-scale projects and distributed solar. We've also done our best to adapt to climate change through community and state-led planning. Our Governor, Jack Markell, and the former DENREC Secretary, Colin O'Mara, led a fantastic bottom-up statewide level planning effort to address the impacts of climate change on water, on agriculture, on ecosystems, infrastructure, and public health. And in December of 2014, they released their climate framework for Delaware, an impressive statewide effort to be prepared for what's coming before it's too late. Delaware, then, I think, is an example of how communities most vulnerable to climate change can work together across public and private sectors to meet the challenge of climate change head-on. That's why I invited my friend and colleague, Senator Whitehouse, a true leader in the work to address climate change, not only in his home state of Rhode Island, but across our country, to come and visit my state. Every week, Senator Whitehouse gives a speech on a different aspect of climate change. And I was proud to participate today in his weekly speech on the topic and thrilled to welcome him to my home state in May as part of his ongoing effort. Now, before I yield the floor to Senator Whitehouse, I just want to tell you about one other stop on our statewide tour, a stop in Prime Hook, one of Delaware's 2 national wildlife refuges. The beach at Prime Hook over the last 60 years has receded more than 500 feet. And over the last decade, storms have broken through the dune line several times, flooding 4,000 acres of previously freshwater marsh. When Hurricane Sandy then hit this already fragile shoreline, leaving this coastline battered, as you can see through this image here, it broke through completely and permanently flooded and destroyed the freshwater marsh. The storm deepened and widened the breach from 300 feet to about 1,500 feet and exacerbated routine flooding on local roads used by the community to access the beach. For a delicate ecosystem like this wildlife refuge, this type of severe weather and flooding can be devastating. And over the last 3 years, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has worked in tandem with other federal agencies, state partners, and NGOs to restore this highly damaged, fragile ecosystem and rebuild the beach's defenses. It's a long story, but you can see the punchline here, which is that as of March 2016, construction's been completed of a newly designed, resloped, redeveloped barrier, which Senator Whitehouse also had the opportunity to visit. And the finished project here is going to be a saltwater marsh that I'm confident will contribute significantly to a durable, resilient, long-term ecosystem. This is just one example of the creative things we're doing in Delaware to address the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. But in some ways, I think the most important and exciting was the last stop in our statewide visit. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Senator Whitehouse, to discuss in more detail his visit to the state of Delaware and our last visit in the southernmost part of our state.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Senator Coons. I'm really grateful to the junior senator from Delaware for inviting me to his home state and for joining me here today for Time to Wake Up speech 139. Senator Coons and I spent a terrific day touring the Delaware shore. You can say what you want about us, but on that day, we were the two wettest members of the United States Senate. I can assure you of that. This is Capitol Hill Oceans Week, Mr. President, and Wednesday is World Oceans Day, so it's a good time to consider the effects of global climate change in our oceans. The oceans have absorbed a third of all carbon dioxide produced since the Industrial Revolution, and over 90% of the excess heat that has resulted. That means that by laws of both physics and chemistry, the oceans are warming, rising, and acidifying. Rhode Island is the ocean state, but give Delaware credit. It generated around $1 billion and over 23,000 jobs from the ocean from the last report in 2013, from tourism, recreation, shipping, and fishing. And like Rhode Island, Delaware sees its sea level rise at a rate of 3 1/3 millimeters per year along the Delaware shore, 13 inches up over the last 100 years. And Delawareans care about this. Over a quarter have reported personally experiencing the effects of sea level rise, 2/3 that they worry about the effects of sea level rise, and over 70% call on the state to take immediate action to combat climate change and sea level rise. I did enjoy our visit in South Wilmington. I did enjoy the visit to Port Mahan, where the road has had to be built up with riprap to protect against sea level rise. But the real prize and the prime reason that I went was Port Mahan's avian connection. Among the sandpipers, ruddy turnstones, and gulls that we saw on the shore was a bird called the Rufa red knot. Red knots stand out from other shorebirds on the beach, not only from their colorful burnt orange plumage, but from the amazing story that accompanies their arrival in Delaware each spring. This is a story to love, and I guess you'd have to say a bird to admire. They only have about a 20-inch wingspan at full growth, and their body is only about the size of a teacup. But each spring, these red knots undertake an epic 9,000-plus mile voyage from Tierra del Fuego on the southern tip of South America all the way up to the Canadian Arctic. After spending the summer nesting in the Arctic, the birds then make the return trip south to winter in the southern hemisphere. This little bird has one of the longest animal migrations of any species on Earth. How does Delaware come into this? Well, the red knots fly straight from Brazil to Delaware Bay. And as you can imagine, when they get there, they are hungry. They've lost as much as half their weight. We were told they actually start ingesting their own organs towards the end for fuel. Well, Delaware Bay is the largest horseshoe crab spawning area in the world. Each May and June, horseshoe crabs emerge from the seas to lay millions of eggs. Nearly 2 million horseshoe crabs were counted in Delaware Bay in 2015, and a female horseshoe crab can lay up to 90,000 eggs per spawning season. So do the math. That's a lot of eggs. And the red knots come here timed just so by Mother Nature to bulk up on those nutritious horseshoe crab eggs to replenish their wasted bodies from that long flight from Brazil to Delaware Bay and to fuel up for the 2,000 further miles of their journey into the Canadian Arctic. Well, I wanted to see this natural wonder before it ends. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lists the red knot as threatened under the Endangered Species Act because, and I'll quote him here, successful annual migration and breeding of red knots is highly dependent on the timing of departures and arrivals to coincide with favorable food and weather conditions in the spring and fall migratory stopover areas and on the Arctic breeding grounds. Climate change can bollocks up that timing. We are already seeing that in a different subspecies of red knot that migrates north along the West African coast. The journal Science last month reported that earlier melting of Arctic snow is accelerating the timeline for hatching of insects, leading to smaller birds. The chicks, less strong, begin to weaken, get out of phase, can't feed as successfully, and it cascades through an array of further difficulties. You actually have got to love this unassuming but astounding little bird. But its survival relies on a cascade of nature's events to line up just right. Nature throws a long bomb from Tierra del Fuego, and off go these birds, and months later they arrive in Delaware Bay, timed to this 450 million-year-old creature, the horseshoe crab, emerging from Delaware Bay to spawn. If one environmental event comes too early or too late, or if one food source becomes too limited, the species could collapse. We got a hint of that in the 1980s when horseshoe crabs became rarer because they were overfished. As their numbers went down, red knot numbers fell in accord. If the changes we're so recklessly putting in motion around the planet disturb nature's fateful timing, the red knot could pay a sad price. Now, some people may snicker and say, well, there he goes again. He's out on the Senate floor. Now he's talking about some stupid bird. But I will say that when you see the voyage that this little bird has to make, a little shorebird used to running along the shore, making this epic voyage every year. One of them has been measured back and forth because of the tag on its ankle to have flown the distance from here to the moon and half a way back in its life. And if you can't see the hand of God in that creature, Mr. President, I weep for your soul. So I thank my colleague from Delaware for his staff and the experts who he brought along to help us learn about this. Like Rhode Island, Delaware is being proactive in addressing the risks that we face and planning for a warmer and a wetter future. And I return my time to the distinguished junior senator.
With that, Mr. President, I want to conclude by commenting that our day together began and ended with citizen science. The very first thing we did was to visit Delaware's National Park to participate in a bio-blitz where volunteers from all over the country were identifying species and categorizing the threats to them from climate change. And the very last thing we did was counting horseshoe crabs along Cape Henlopen shore. And I must say, my colleague from Rhode Island, even though there was driving rain and difficult conditions, was passionate and determined to do everything we could to contribute to the counting effort of the horseshoe crabs that day. It was a terrific opportunity for us to see a state that's engaged in planning and preparation and to witness one of the most remarkable migrations across our globe. I just want to express in closing my gratitude to Senator Whitehouse for his very real leadership on this issue. I'm sorry?
Would the senator yield for a question?
The senator will yield for a question.
Were we indeed the two wettest senators that day?
We were indeed the most persistently wet senators, I suspect, in the entire country by the end of a very, very wet but very fulfilling day up and down the state of Delaware. With that, I'd like to thank my colleague from Rhode Island, and Mr. President, I yield the floor.